When I told my parents I couldn't wait for tomorrow's family reunion, my sister laughed. "Sweetheart," she said, sipping her wine, "you're not invited." They all thought it was funny. I smiled, too. But that night, I started planning something they'd never laugh at again. By the time the reunion started, my invitation wasn't a card. It was a reckoning. My name is Clara Whitmore. I am 33 years old, and my world is one of carefully constructed order. I work as a compliance specialist for a major pharmaceutical corporation, a job that most people find soul-crushingly dull. For me, it's a sanctuary. In my professional life, there are regulations, statutes, and clearly defined protocols. There is right and wrong, black and white, a logical framework that governs every action. My performance is measured in meticulously documented reports, in audits passed without a single finding, in the quiet, sterile hum of a system functioning as it should. It's a world I built for myself, a fortress of facts and figures, because the world I was born into, the world of my family, operates on an entirely different, far more treacherous set of rules. We live in Silver Grove, Illinois, a suburb so relentlessly perfect it feels like a movie set. The lawns are emerald green and unnaturally uniform. The colonial-style houses are vast and impeccably maintained, and the smiles on the faces of our neighbors are as bright and brittle as porcelain. The Whitmore family fits right in. From the outside, we are the picture of American success. My father, a senior executive at the same corporation where I work, is a pillar of the community. My mother is a paragon of suburban grace, her life a curated collection of charity luncheons and garden club meetings. And then there is my sister, Danielle. Danielle is 3 years my junior, and she is the sun around which the Whitmore family orbits. She was born with a light inside her that I seem to lack, an effortless charm that draws people in like moths to a flame. She is beautiful in the way that magazines tell you to be, blonde, blue-eyed, with a laugh that sounds like wind chimes, while I was the quiet, serious child with my nose in a book. Danielle was the one performing pirouettes in the living room, her every move met with rapturous applause from our parents. She was and always has been their queen. They never said it outright. Of course, in a family like ours, everything important is left unsaid, conveyed through the subtle tilt of a head, the allocation of attention, the unspoken hierarchy that everyone understands. The roles were assigned early on. I was the practical one, the reliable one. Danielle was the one to be proud of. Being the practical one meant I was the one who learnt how to reset the Wi-Fi router when it went down, who figured out the complexities of our parents' tax returns, who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, and scheduled the plumber. Being the one to be proud of meant Danielle's C+ on a history paper was framed and displayed on the mantelpiece, because she had tried so hard. Bless her heart. My academic scholarships were acknowledged with a polite nod, as if they were merely what was expected, like a utility bill paid on time. Her brief, disastrous foray into pottery, which produced a lopsided ashtray, was hailed as a flowering of artistic genius. It was a constant, low-grade fever of inequity that I learned to live with, a baseline of my existence. This dynamic naturally extended into our professional lives. When it came time for me to find a job, I submitted hundreds of applications, went through grueling rounds of interviews, and earned my position in the compliance department through sheer, unadulterated effort. I worked my way up project by project, audit by audit. Danielle, upon graduating with a degree in communications, found her entry into the corporate world to be significantly smoother. My father made a call. Just like that, a position was created for her in the public relations department of a subsidiary under the same corporate umbrella. She works on the floor that designs the glossy brochures and crafts the feel-good press releases. I work in the wing that pores over the fine print to make sure those brochures don't promise a cure we can't deliver, that the press releases don't violate SEC regulations. She builds the narrative. I ensure the narrative is legally defensible. She is the artist. I am the janitor, who cleans up the potential messes. To my family, my career is a stable, sensible, and utterly unglamorous utility. Danielle's is a source of endless fascination. Every family dinner, at my parents' house, is a showcase for her latest triumph. The house itself is a monument to this curated perfection, all cream-colored carpets, polished dark wood, and abstract art that was chosen because it matched the sofas. It's a place where dust is not allowed to settle and genuine emotion is viewed with deep suspicion. We sit around the long mahogany table, the crystal glasses gleaming under the recessed lighting, and the conversation invariably turns to Danielle. "Dani, darling, tell us about the new campaign launch," my mother will prompt, her eyes shining with adoration. Danielle will then regale us with stories of brainstorming sessions fueled by artisanal coffee, of schmoozing with journalists, of the clever tagline she supposedly invented that is now being considered for a national rollout. It is all performance, a carefully rehearsed monologue of success, and my parents consume it with an insatiable appetite. When her story is finished, a brief, obligatory silence will follow before my father turns his gaze to me. His eyes, so warm when looking at his younger daughter, become analytical, assessing. "And you, Clara?" he'll ask, his tone polite but distant, everything compliant. I will offer a brief, factual summary of my work, a successful internal audit, a new regulatory framework I've implemented. My words land with a thud in the carefully managed atmosphere of the dining room. They are dense, technical, devoid of the sparkle that infuses Danielle's tales. Then comes the inevitable, the question that has been a dagger in my side for over a decade. "That's good, Clara," my mother will say, her smile a mask of strained encouragement. "But are you learning anything from your sister? You know, about how to present things, how to engage with people." I learned long ago not to react, not to let the sting show on my face. I would just smile, a tight, practiced curve of my lips, and murmur something non-committal. PR and compliance are very different fields, I might say. My voice even, but inside, a small, cold knot would tighten in my stomach. The implication was always clear, Danielle's path was the correct one, the aspirational one. My path was a necessary, but unfortunate detour, into the tedious mechanics of the world. I was the foundation, solid and buried. She was the spire, catching the sun. The night it all broke, we were having one of these dinners. The air was thick with the scent of roasted rosemary chicken, and Danielle's expensive perfume. She had spent 20 minutes describing a celebrity endorsement she had secured, and my parents were practically glowing. I had been quiet, nursing a glass of water, waiting for the performance to end. When there was a lull, I made my mistake. Thinking of the upcoming annual family gathering, a large catered affair that my father used as a networking opportunity, I mentioned it. "I was just looking over the event details," I said, attempting to join the flow of conversation. "I'm really looking forward to the reunion this year." The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. My father cleared his throat. My mother suddenly found a microscopic speck of lint on her sleeve to be fascinating. "And Danielle?" Danielle laughed. It wasn't her usual charming, wind chime laugh. This was different. It was a short, sharp, condescending burst of sound, laced with pity. She picked up her wine glass, swirling the deep red liquid, and looked at me over the rim, as if I were a curious, but simple-minded pet. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "That about that, you're not invited." Her words hung in the air, sharp and clear as shattered glass. I stared at her, then at my parents, waiting for one of them to correct her, to say it was a joke, but they didn't. My father's gaze shifted to his plate. My mother's smile became even more strained. Danielle continued, clearly enjoying her moment. "It's more of a leadership and key personnel thing this year. Dad's idea, you know, to celebrate the company's visionaries. It's not really for mid-level employees. She said the words mid-level employees as if they were contagion, a distasteful substance she had to force from her lips. And then they all laughed. My father let out a low chuckle, a sound of uncomfortable amusement. My mother produced a faint, twittering sound, the social reflex of a woman who has learned that smoothing over any unpleasantness is her primary function. They all thought it was funny, a harmless bit of family teasing. My exclusion, my public humiliation at the table where I was supposed to belong, was a source of light entertainment. I smiled. Too, it was the only defense I had left, the mask I had perfected over a lifetime. I felt the muscles in my face pull into a shape that resembled amusement. Even as the cold knot in my stomach turned to ice, I didn't say a word. I simply nodded as if I understood completely, as if it made perfect sense that I, the practical one, the one who ensured the company didn't get sued into oblivion, was not a key person. But inside my head, something shifted. It felt like a physical event, a heavy industrial switch being thrown in a dark room, flooding it with harsh, unforgiving light. The years of quiet resentment, of swallowed insults, of striving for an approval that would never be granted, it all coalesced in that single, blinding moment. The low-grade fever I'd lived with for so long broke, and in its place was a chilling, absolute clarity. The game was rigged. My role had been cast, and no amount of hard work or quiet competence would ever change it. So I would stop playing. I would change the game. As they laughed, I sat in silence, my smile fixed in place, and the first pieces of a new plan began to click into place in my mind, as neat and orderly as a perfectly filed audit report. The week following that dinner was an exercise in practiced normalcy. On the surface, nothing had changed. I arrived at the office at 7:45 a.m. Each morning, the precise time that allowed me to avoid the main elevator rush, but still appeared diligent. My office was a glass-walled cube on the 17th floor, a space I had earned through years of meticulous work. It overlooked the meticulously landscaped corporate campus, a sterile panorama of green lawns and strategically placed oak trees. The building itself was a monument to modern capitalism, all steel, glass, and hushed, climate-controlled air. The silence was punctuated only by the soft click of keyboards and the distant electronic chime of an arriving elevator. It was a world of order, a world I understood. But the switch that had been thrown in my mind at the dinner table was still engaged. The world looked the same, but the light was different now. Everything was sharper, colder. I was no longer just a compliance specialist. I was a hunter, waiting. I didn't have to wait long. The attack, when it came, wasn't a direct confrontation. In our world, in my family, aggression is never so straightforward. It's a thing of whispers, of strategically placed words, of invisible currents that pull you under before you even realize you're in deep water. I discovered it by accident, which was almost certainly not part of Danielle's plan. I was tasked with reviewing a cross-departmental communication protocol, a mind-numbing assignment that involved sifting through months of email chains. Late on a Tuesday afternoon, as the office lights began to cast long shadows across the grey carpet, I found it buried at the bottom of a long, forwarded thread, a message that I was never meant to see. My superior, Vice President Arthur Coulson, had forwarded a directive to me, and in his haste, he had failed to delete the preceding conversation. The original email was from Danielle. My blood ran cold as I read the words on my screen. The subject line was innocuous, quick thought on the Q3 Synergy project. The body of the email was a masterpiece of corporate assassination cloaked in the language of helpful concern. Arthur, it began, with a familiarity that immediately set my teeth on edge, hope you're having a great week. I wanted to flag something proactively regarding the PR elements of the Synergy project. We are running into some significant bottlenecks with compliance, and I'm a bit worried about our timeline. Clara is, as always, incredibly thorough, but her approach is proving to be quite rigid. She's creating difficulties for the PR team with her interpretation of the disclosure guidelines, and it's slowing down our entire creative process. We've also been waiting on her audit reports for the preliminary campaign budget, and the delay is starting to impact vendor negotiations. I know she's my sister, which makes this awkward, but I felt I had a duty to the project to raise this. I read it once, then twice, then a third time, dissecting each sentence, each carefully chosen word. It was all lies, but they were brilliant lies. They were lies woven with just enough truth to be plausible. Was I thorough? Yes, it was my job to be. I was the last line of defense against lawsuits and federal investigations. But she had twisted thorough into rigid. Was I carefully interpreting disclosure guidelines? Of course. The alternative was a multi-million-dollar fine from the FTC. She had framed it as creating difficulties, and the delayed audit reports. I had submitted them 2 days ahead of schedule. The delay was with her own department, which had failed to provide the necessary invoices. She had taken her team's failure and pinned it squarely on me. She had even used our family connection, not as a shield, but as a sword, portraying herself as the reluctant hero forced to speak out against her own sister for the good of the company. It was a poison dart, and it had hit its mark. The next morning, I was summoned to Coulson's office. His was a corner suite on the executive floor, a space that smelled of expensive leather and ambition. He was a man in his late 50s with perfectly coiffed silver hair and the easy, predatory smile of someone who has never had to doubt his own authority. He didn't ask me to sit. He remained standing behind his enormous mahogany desk, creating a physical barrier that reinforced the professional one. "Clara," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "We are making some adjustments to the departmental structure, a strategic realignment to enhance efficiency." I said nothing. I just stood there, my hands clasped behind my back, my expression neutral. "The Synergy project is entering a new, more dynamic phase," he continued, steepling his fingers. "We need to be agile. We need to empower the creative teams. To that end, I'm moving you off the primary oversight role for that project. Your talents would be better utilized focusing on the historical data audits from the Maxwell acquisition. It's crucial work. Foundational. Foundational. The same kind of language my parents used. Necessary but buried. Unseen. Of course, Arthur, I said, my voice betraying no emotion. Good, he said, relieved that I wasn't going to make a scene. Logistics will be in touch about relocating your workspace, and your access credentials will be updated to reflect your new responsibilities by the end of the day. That was it. In a conversation that lasted less than 3 minutes, my career was kneecapped. By the time I returned to my glass cube, the process had already begun. A red error message flashed on my screen when I tried to access the Synergy project drive. Access denied. My name had been removed from the primary compliance distribution list. The email from logistics came an hour later. I was being moved to a cubicle in the open-plan workspace on the 12th floor, a noisy, anonymous sea of identical desks known internally as the bullpen. I was no longer a specialist with an office. I was just another drone. As I packed the contents of my desk into a sterile brown cardboard box, my compliance manuals, a single-framed photo of a lake I'd once visited, a chipped coffee mug, the final piece of the puzzle slotted into place. This wasn't just about a project. This was Danielle extending the borders of her kingdom. The family dining room had been her court, and now she was conquering the corporate world, ensuring that the unspoken hierarchy of our home was replicated in the place I had considered my refuge. She was reinforcing my role as the practical, backstage support for her starring performance. A memory surfaced, sharp and painful. It was from a few years ago, at a Christmas party. Danielle had just received a promotion. I had congratulated her, and she had smiled that dazzling, dismissive smile of hers. "Thanks, sis," she'd said, patting my arm. "You know, we all have our roles. You're just so good at all the details, the behind-the-scenes stuff. It's a real talent. You're much better suited for backstage than the spotlight." She had meant it as a compliment, or at least a statement of fact, as she saw it. I was the stagehand. She was the star. And now she was actively working to keep me there, nailing the doors to the wings shut. I sealed the box with tape. I looked out the window of my office one last time at the perfect, manicured world below. The shock and the hurt had already burned away, leaving behind something hard and pure, a diamond-like resolve. Danielle wanted the stage. She craved the spotlight, the applause, the adoration. She believed it was her birthright. Very well, I thought. I would give it to her. I would build her the grandest stage she had ever seen. I would make sure all the lights were on her, that every eye in the house was fixed upon her. And then, when the moment was just right, I would pull a single lever, and I would turn that stage into the pyre on which she would burn. My new desk on the 12th floor was small and grey. I was surrounded by the noise and chatter of the call center and the data entry teams. My access was gone. My authority was stripped. To the rest of the company, I was a failure. A demoted functionary. They were wrong. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just checking boxes and following rules. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just checking boxes and following rules. I was starting my own project. My real work was just beginning. That night, I didn't go straight home. I went to the company archives in the sub-basement, a place no one ever visited. I used my old, still active security badge to access the room. Under the flickering fluorescent lights, surrounded by shelves of forgotten files and obsolete data tapes, I began to gather my evidence. My field was compliance. I knew where every single corporate body was buried because I was the one who had written the burial permits. And I knew with absolute certainty that my sister, Danielle, in her rush to the spotlight, had left a trail. I just had to find it. My days in the bullpen were a study in anonymity. I became a ghost in the corporate machine, a pale figure hunched over a keyboard in a sea of identical grey cubicles. The constant, low-level hum of the 12th floor, 100 quiet conversations, the rattle of the air conditioning, the endless trill of phones, was the soundtrack to my new life. I performed the tasks assigned to me with the same diligence as always, processing the historical data from the Maxwell acquisition with a robotic efficiency that drew no attention. But my real work began when the sun went down, when the noise subsided and the floor emptied out, leaving only the faint bluish glow of monitor screens and the lonely hum of the servers. The night was my domain. My demotion had been designed to clip my wings, to remove me from the flow of vital information. Coulson and Danielle had made one critical error, however. In their haste to shunt me aside, they had downgraded my user profile, not rebuilt it. They had revoked my access to active projects, but they hadn't scrubbed the legacy permissions. The digital keys to the company's attics and basements. I still had access to the archival servers. The vast digital graveyards where old projects, forgotten reports, and every corporate secret imaginable went to die. No one cared about data from last year or the year before. The company's focus was always on the next quarter, the next product launch. The past was a liability, a thing to be stored and forgotten. For me, it was a hunting ground. I began my search with a simple hypothesis. Danielle was arrogant, and arrogant people get sloppy. She believed she was untouchable, protected by her charm and our father's influence. This belief would be her undoing. I didn't look for evidence of her slandering me, that was a personal battle, and the company wouldn't care to bring her down. I needed a corporate crime, fraud, embezzlement, something cold, hard, and irrefutable, something that would make my father's influence a liability rather than a shield. I focused my search on her department's budgets from the previous fiscal year, a period of rapid, chaotic growth where oversight had been notoriously lax. For 3 nights, I sat in the silent, empty office, navigating the labyrinthine directory structure of the backup servers. It was painstaking work, like panning for gold in a river of mud. I opened hundreds of files, my eyes scanning spreadsheets and budget proposals until the numbers began to blur. Most were exactly what they seemed, legitimate, boring, and useless to me. I was beginning to feel a flicker of doubt, a cold whisper that perhaps Danielle was smarter than I thought. When I finally saw it, tucked away in a subfolder titled MI Spent Logistics FY24, was a file that made my pulse quicken. The file name was Family Event Budget. It was a stupid, amateurish mistake. Using the word family in a file name on a corporate server was like screaming for an audit. But it was also the exact kind of lazy, arrogant shortcut Danielle would take, naming it something she would easily remember, never imagining that someone like me would ever be looking for it. My hands were steady as I double-clicked the file. The familiar green and white grid of Microsoft Excel materialized on my screen. At first glance, it looked like any other event budget. There were line items for venue rental, catering, audiovisual equipment, and speaker fees, but one section near the bottom was labeled Charitable Partner Donations. Beneath it was a list of 5 transactions, each for a substantial 5-figure sum, all directed to something called the Evergreen Youth Foundation. A notes column to the right contained a single, damning entry, repeated for each transaction, expense approved by D. Whitmore, her initial, a flagrant violation of protocol. An expense of that size required a vice president's signature. Danielle didn't have that authority. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a slow, heavy beat in the profound silence of the office. I knew with the certainty of a predator catching a scent that the Evergreen Youth Foundation was not a real charity. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I opened a browser and ran a search. Nothing. I tried the national database of registered nonprofits. Nothing. It didn't exist. So, where had the money gone? The spreadsheet contained transaction IDs for each payment. This was my key. Using my residual permissions, I accessed the company's financial processing system, a powerful, archaic piece of software that logged every single dollar that moved in or out of the corporation. The system was a fortress, but I knew the back doors. I plugged in the first transaction ID. The system whirred for a moment before spitting out the details. The payment had not been routed to any foundation. It had been paid out as a marketing services bonus to a third-party vendor. I recognized it, a high-end agency known for managing celebrity and influencer contracts. I checked the other 4 transactions. It was the same story for each. In total, just over $240,000. Danielle hadn't made a donation. She had disguised bonus payments to marketing partners as a charitable contribution, likely to circumvent the strict approval process and budget caps on executive and vendor bonuses. It was blatant, unambiguous wire fraud. The next question was how she had gotten the payments through the system without the required VP-level approval. The digital signature on the transaction was, as expected, Arthur Coulson's, but he was too cautious, too politically savvy to sign off on something so obviously fraudulent. He might bend the rules, but he wouldn't risk his career like this. I dug deeper, pulling up the metadata for the approval entry. The signature was legitimate, but the timestamp was what caught my eye, 11:47 p.m. on a Sunday. Coulson was a notorious 9-to-5 who bragged about never checking his email on the weekend. He wouldn't be in the system approving payments at midnight on a Sunday. But Danielle, a notorious night owl who often boasted about her late-night creative bursts, certainly would be. She must have gotten his password or exploited a logged-in computer. She had used his digital identity to push through her fraudulent scheme. Now I needed the final, irrefutable link. I needed to place her virtual hand on the keyboard. This was the most dangerous part. Accessing the system's deep-level IT security logs was far beyond my current clearance. A request would trigger alarms all the way up the chain. But I knew that for maintenance purposes, the system performed a full diagnostic dump to a secure partition on the archival server every 24 hours. These dumps were encrypted, but the encryption keys were stored in a compliance subdirectory that, miraculously, I could still access. It was a digital loophole, a forgotten back door left open by a lazy IT admin years ago. It took me almost 2 hours to locate the diagnostic file for the correct date, decrypt it, and parse the millions of lines of system data. My eyes burned from staring at the screen, at the endless scroll of text. I ran a search for the transaction IDs. I found the approval command, and right next to it, logged in plain text, was the digital fingerprint. I was looking for the IP address of the machine from which the command was executed. My breath hitched. I ran the IP address through the company's network allocation database. The result came back in less than a second. A single line of text on my screen that sealed my sister's fate. The IP address was hardwired to the network port at the desk assigned to Danielle Whitmore. I leaned back in my chair, the worn fabric groaning in the silence. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was done. I had her. Methodically, I began to build my case file. I took screenshots of the spreadsheet, the financial system records, the metadata, and the final, damning IP address log. I compiled everything into a single, password-protected document. Then, I sent the file to the large network printer at the far end of the deserted office. The quiet whirring of the machine was the only sound in the cavernous room. It sounded like a countdown. I walked over and collected the warm pages, the ink still smelling fresh. The evidence felt solid, real, and heavy in my hands. I slipped the stack of papers into a plain manila envelope, tucked it into my bag, and walked out of the office. Not looking back, I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that I was holding a declaration of war. An internal fraud investigation was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability, and I would be the one to choose the time and place of the first battle. It would not be in a sterile corporate boardroom. It would be at the Whitmore family reunion, the very event from which I had been so callously excluded. Danielle had wanted a party for the company's visionaries. I would make sure it was a celebration she would never forget. The explosion was coming, and it would be perfectly timed to bring the whole fraudulent, perfect-looking house down. The preparations for the annual Whitmore Family Associates reunion began, as they always did, with an almost military level of logistical precision, completely devoid of any genuine warmth. The chosen venue was our family's lake villa at Maple Crest, a sprawling, architecturally severe glass and cedar structure that my father had built to impress his colleagues, not to comfort his family. The villa wasn't a home, it was a statement. It loomed over the dark, unnervingly still waters of the lake, its vast picture windows looking out like vacant eyes. Inside, the decor was a monument to expensive minimalist taste, all sharp angles, cold marble floors, and furniture so uncomfortable it seemed designed to repel lingering. It was the perfect setting for a Whitmore gathering, luxurious, imposing, and fundamentally artificial. My mother threw herself into the arrangements with a frantic energy. Her phone perpetually pressed to her ear as she terrorized caterers, florists, and valets. Every detail had to be perfect, every surface polished to a high sheen to maintain the flawless facade of our family's success. My father, for his part, obsessed over the guest list, a carefully curated collection of senior executives, potential clients, and local politicians. It was a networking event masquerading as a family reunion. Though I was no longer on the official guest list, I was still expected to be present. My role, it seemed, had been downgraded from non-person to unpaid event staff. I was an accessory, a familiar piece of furniture that was expected to be in its proper place. At the center of this whirlwind of performative celebration was Danielle. Having been designated the visionary of the family, she was naturally tasked with giving the opening address. My mother announced it during a brief, tense planning call, her voice beaming with pride. "Dani will be delivering the welcome toast," she'd said. "She just so perfectly represents the vibrant, forward-thinking spirit of the family." I listened on mute, a small and sarcastic smile playing on my lips. Danielle's vibrant spirit was currently manifesting as a series of imperious emails to everyone involved in the planning. She was in her element, delegating tasks she deemed beneath her, and basking in the glow of her self-appointed importance. I saw the draft of her speech. She had carelessly left it on the kitchen counter during a visit to our parents' house. It was an insufferable word salad of corporate buzzwords and saccharine platitudes. She'd woven in nauseating phrases like synergizing familial bonds with corporate excellence and leveraging our legacy to build the future. It was a speech about nothing, designed to sound like it was about everything. It was Danielle in literary form. My own role in this grand production was assigned to me a few days later. My mother called me, her voice a careful blend of condescension and feigned affection. "Clara, darling," she began. "I know you have so much on your plate, but we were hoping you could help with something for the reunion," she continued. "A little something to make you feel involved." I waited, my expression placid. "Of course, Mom, whatever you need." Danielle is putting together a wonderful slideshow to play during her speech, just a few photos to celebrate the family's journey, you know, and we thought with your wonderful organizational skills, you would be the perfect person to manage the technical side of it, just making sure the file works, running the presentation from the laptop. It was a small thing, a role so minor, so utterly devoid of prestige that it was beneath even the caterer's notice. It was the digital equivalent of being asked to hand out name tags at the door. They were giving me the job of a glorified AV technician, a backstage role for the girl who was better suited for the wings. The irony was so thick, so exquisitely perfect that I almost laughed. They had no idea they were handing me the loaded gun. "I'd be happy to," I said, my voice a model of quiet helpfulness. "Just have Dani send me the file." My compliance was met with a sigh of relief from my mother. I had accepted my demotion with grace, playing my part as the dutiful, unassuming daughter perfectly. I was invisible to them, and in my invisibility, I had found my greatest strength. They looked at me and saw the practical, reliable Clara, who could be counted on to handle the tedious details. They were incapable of seeing the woman who had spent the last 2 weeks methodically building a case for grand larceny against their golden child. Their blindness was my camouflage. The night before the reunion, the PowerPoint file arrived in my inbox. The email from Danielle was brief and dismissive. "Here's the file for tomorrow. Don't mess it up." I opened it. It was exactly as I'd expected, a nauseatingly self-congratulatory montage. Photos of a young, beaming Danielle on horseback. A photo of my father cutting the ribbon at a new building dedication. A shot of Danielle accepting some minor industry award. My parents looking on with expressions of rapturous pride. I was present in only 2 of the 30 photos, a blurry figure in the background, partially obscured by a floral arrangement. The presentation was a monument to their curated reality, a highlight reel from which I had been almost entirely edited out. I sat in the dark of my apartment, the only light coming from my laptop screen, and I went to work. I didn't delete her slides. I left her saccharine narrative completely intact. My contribution would be subtle. It would be a single, surgical strike. I created a new slide. I didn't use the festive, branded template Danielle had chosen. Instead, I used a stark white background, the kind used for internal audit reports. I took the cleanest, most damning screenshot from my evidence file, the section of the spreadsheet showing the 5 fraudulent transactions to the non-existent Evergreen Youth Foundation, with the column of charitable partner donations clearly labeled. I made sure the note, expense approved by D. Whitmore, was perfectly legible. Above the image, I typed a simple question in a bold, black sans serif font. Charity or cover-up? It was perfect. It wasn't an accusation. It was coded to appear only when the presentation was played in full screen mode, triggered to launch automatically after the final, triumphant photo of Danielle faded to black. It was a digital time bomb hidden in plain sight, and only I had the detonator. I saved the modified file, replacing her original on the shared drive. I double-checked the code. It was flawless. My work was done. The trap was set. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the sleeping city. A profound sense of calm washed over me. A tranquility I hadn't felt in years. The constant low-level anxiety that had been my companion for as long as I could remember had vanished, replaced by the quiet hum of purpose. The injustice that had simmered inside me for decades had finally been cooled and forged into a weapon. It was sharp, it was precise, and it was ready. For the first time in months, I went to bed and slept soundly, a deep and dreamless sleep, like the still, dark waters of Maple Crest Lake, waiting for the morning to come. The great hall of the Maple Villa was aglow. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls revealed the inky blackness of the lake and the pinprick lights of distant houses, creating the illusion that we were all floating in a warm, gilded bubble suspended in the night. Waitstaff in crisp black uniforms moved silently through the crowd, their silver trays laden with champagne flutes and intricate canapes. The air hummed with the sound of success, the clinking of crystal, the murmur of polite conversation, and the bright, brittle peals of laughter from people who had learned to laugh on command. It was a perfect illusion, a carefully staged production of happiness and prosperity, and every guest was playing their part beautifully. I stood in the shadows at the back of the hall beside a small table draped in black cloth. On it sat my laptop, connected by a series of cables to the large projection screen that hung, for the moment dark and dormant, above a small elevated stage. I was the technician, the stagehand, a part of the machinery that made the magic happen. No one paid any attention to me. My simple black dress was designed to make me fade into the background. I was a ghost at my own family's feast, and I had never felt more powerful. From my vantage point, I could see everything. I saw my father holding court with a state senator, his laugh a little too loud. I saw my mother gliding between groups of guests, her smile a fixed, dazzling mask of social perfection. And I saw Danielle. She was the radiant center of it all, a vision in a stark white dress that stood out like a beacon against the dark suits and jewel-toned gowns of the guests. She moved through the room with the effortless grace of a born queen, accepting compliments, bestowing dazzling smiles, and touching arms with a familiarity that was both intimate and dismissive. She was in her element, the star of a show written, produced, and directed by her. After about an hour of mingling, my father stepped onto the stage and tapped a microphone. The polite hum of conversation died down. "Welcome, everyone," he said, beaming. "It gives me immense pleasure to see so many friends and esteemed colleagues here tonight. To kick things off, I'd like to invite my daughter, Danielle, to the stage to offer a toast. She's the embodiment of the next generation of leadership, and a true credit to the Whitmore name." A ripple of applause followed Danielle, as she ascended the 2 short steps to the stage. She took the microphone from my father, her movements fluid and confident. She looked out at the sea of adoring faces, waited for the room to fall completely silent, and then raised her champagne flute. "Family," she began, her voice resonating with a practiced sincerity that made my stomach turn. They say that family is the foundation of all success. And looking out at all of you tonight, our extended corporate family, I know that to be true. As she spoke, she gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was my cue. My fingers were steady on the trackpad. I clicked, and the show began. The first slide appeared on the screen behind her, a sun-drenched photo of our parents on their wedding day. The guests murmured in appreciation. The next slide was of a toddler-aged Danielle, her blonde curls a halo around her angelic face. More appreciative sounds. The slideshow continued, a carefully curated journey through the Whitmore family's greatest hits. My father breaking ground on a new corporate wing. My mother cutting the ribbon at a charity ball. Danielle on the podium with her university debate team. Each image was a testament to their perfect life, a brick in the flawless facade. I kept my eyes on Danielle. She was magnificent. Her speech perfectly timed to the images appearing behind her. She was weaving a narrative of legacy, of hard work, of a family bound by love and ambition. The guests were captivated, hanging on her every word. She was in the spotlight, exactly where she had always wanted to be. She was approaching her grand finale, the last photo in her self-congratulatory montage. It was a recent, professionally taken shot of her, looking poised and powerful at her desk. And so, as we look to the future, she said, her voice swelling with emotion, let us raise a glass to the foundations that hold us up, and to the bold vision that will carry us forward. The final photo of her faded from the screen. For a single, pregnant second, the screen was black. I saw a few people in the front row begin to raise their glasses, and then my slide appeared. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The stark white background and black, blocky text were a violent slash across the canvas of the evening's soft focus elegance. The image of the spreadsheet, with its damning figures and her name attached to them, was clinical and brutally clear. The question hung in the air, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, charity or cover-up. A wave of confusion rippled through the hall. The polite smiles froze on the faces of the guests. A low murmur started near the back and spread like a contagion. People were leaning toward each other, whispering, pointing at the screen. What was this? Some kind of bizarre joke. Danielle had her back to the screen, but she felt the shift in the room's energy immediately. The wave of adoration she had been surfing suddenly collapsed beneath her. Her smile faltered. She glanced over her shoulder, a flicker of irritation in her eyes, and then she saw it. I watched as the color drained from her face. Her body went rigid, as if she'd been struck by lightning. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The champagne flute in her hand trembled, the golden liquid sloshing against the rim for a moment that stretched into an eternity. She was frozen, a deer caught in the blinding headlights of her own public relations disaster. My father, standing at the side of the stage, was the first to speak. His face was a thundercloud of disbelief and fury. Danielle, he said, his voice low and dangerous, cutting through the growing whispers of the crowd. What is that? Her head snapped toward him, her eyes wide with panic. She fumbled for the remote clicker in her hand, the one used to advance the slides. She aimed it at the screen and started mashing the forward button, but nothing happened. The macro item embedded had disabled the manual controls. She was trapped. Her carefully constructed performance had been hijacked. Then, as if to answer my father's question, the slide changed. My second piece of work appeared on the screen, even more stark and brutal than the first. It was just a single line of text in the same cold, corporate font, an authorized expense approval, $240,000. The murmuring in the room erupted into a cacophony of shocked gasps and frantic whispers. The number, so specific and so large, hung in the air like a verdict. The illusion of the perfect evening was not just cracked, it was utterly shattered. Guests were no longer looking at Danielle with adoration. They were looking at her, as if she were a particularly fascinating car crash. This was my cue. I pushed my chair back, the sound of its legs scraping on the floor unnaturally loud in the charged atmosphere. I walked out from the shadows of my technical station, and into the dim light of the hall. I moved with a calm, deliberate pace, my expression one of mild, helpful concern. I stopped a few feet from the stage, in the sight line of my father and half the room. All eyes were on the unfolding drama, the collapsing star on the stage. I let the chaos swell for one more moment before I spoke. My voice pitched just loud enough to be heard over the noise. Someone, I said, with a tone of gentle, apologetic discovery, must have forgotten to delete that slide. My calmly delivered line sliced through the chaotic hubbub of the room, and for a moment, a stunned, absolute silence fell. Every eye which had been darting between Danielle, my father, and the damning screen now swiveled to me. I had presented them with a plausible, innocent explanation, a technical glitch, a forgotten slide left over from a draft. It was a lifeline, a chance for them to dismiss this whole horrifying spectacle as an unfortunate mistake. For a split second, I saw the hope flicker in my mother's eyes. But Danielle, in her panic, refused to take it. She lunged for the lifeline and, in her desperation, tore it to shreds. "No, that's not. It's a mistake," she shrieked, her voice a shrill, ugly thing that bore no resemblance to her usual melodic cadence. She turned to the crowd, her arms spread wide in a gesture of frantic appeal. "This is a fabrication, a technical error. I don't know how that got there. I've never seen it before." Her denials were too loud, too shrill, too desperate. She was a PR professional, and she was committing the cardinal sin of crisis management. She looked and sounded utterly and completely guilty. As I watched her self-destruct, I allowed a flicker of concern to cross my face, a mask of sisterly worry that I had perfected over a lifetime of practice. But inside, I was a silent, rapt observer in the front row of the greatest show on earth. I was watching a star implode. Of course, I had never intended for my single slide to be the entire case against her. It was merely the opening act, the public spectacle designed to create chaos and strip away her defenses. The real, substantive attack was happening concurrently in the silent digital world. As Danielle was delivering the first line of her toast, a pre-scheduled, encrypted email had been sent from a secure, anonymous Proton account. It was addressed to the head of the Internal Audit Department, with a carbon copy sent to the Chief Legal Officer. The subject line was simple and impossible to ignore: urgent potential executive fraud. Project Synergy. The body of the email contained the full, unredacted evidence file, the spreadsheets, the transaction logs, the IP address traces, and a concise, dispassionate summary of Danielle's $240,000 scheme to defraud the company. The public humiliation was the theater. The anonymous email was the executioner's warrant. While Danielle continued her panic tirade, claiming sabotage and corporate espionage, a sharp buzzing sound cut through the air. It was my father's phone, vibrating violently against the polished wood of the lectern where he'd placed it. The sound seemed to command the room's attention more effectively than any microphone. Every whisper died out. Every head turned to watch him. His movements were stiff, robotic. He picked up the phone, his thumb swiping across the screen. The phone's light cast an eerie blue glow on his face, carving deep shadows under his eyes and tightening the lines of his mouth into a grimace. From where I stood, I couldn't see the screen, but I didn't need to. I knew exactly what it would say. I could picture it perfectly: a message from Robert Harrison, the company's CEO, a man who valued his company's reputation above all else, a man who would have just been forwarded my email by his legal team. The message would be short, devoid of pleasantries. Something like, "Arthur, we have a serious problem. Need to discuss your daughter's involvement immediately. The change in my father's demeanor was profound. The fury he had directed at Danielle moments before evaporated, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. This was no longer a family embarrassment. It had metastasized in the space of a few seconds into a corporate catastrophe that threatened to engulf him, his reputation, and his career. He looked from his phone to Danielle, and for the first time in my life, I saw him look at his favorite daughter with something other than blind adoration. I saw the cold, hard calculation of a man assessing a liability. It was at that moment that my mother finally broke. A terrible, strangled sob escaped her lips. She brought her hands to her face, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling. Her collapse was not loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, internal implosion. She was not crying for Danielle's presumed guilt, or the betrayal it represented. She was crying for the guest list, for the state senator, who was now backing slowly toward the exit, for the judgmental eyes of the other corporate wives. She was crying for the cracks that had just shattered the flawless porcelain of her life. Through all of this, I remained perfectly still, an island of calm in a sea of chaos. I arranged my features into an expression of deep, sorrowful concern. I was the good daughter, the reliable one, caught in the horrifying crossfire of my sister's inexplicable public breakdown. I was a pillar of quiet strength. Inside, however, a cold, clean fire of triumph was blazing. Every sob for my mother, every flicker of fear in my father's eyes was a note in a symphony composed just for me. The chaos swirled, a vortex of whispers and shifting bodies as guests began to make their excuses and retreat from the toxic blast radius of our family's implosion. And in the heart of that vortex, Danielle's wild, panicked gaze finally found mine. Our eyes locked across the ruined landscape of the party. The frantic denials died on her lips. In the space of a single silent moment, I saw the realization dawn in her eyes. She saw me. Not the mousy backstage sister, but the architect of her ruin. The demotion, the convenient technical assignment, the cold calm on my face. It all clicked into place in her mind. She took a clumsy step toward me, stumbling off the low stage. Her white dress, once so radiant, now looked like a funeral shroud. She stopped a few feet away, her face a mask of dawning horror and pure, unadulterated hatred. "You," she whispered, her voice hoarse and barely audible over the din, "you did this." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, an accusation born of absolute, sole certainty. I didn't break eye contact. I leaned in slightly, as if sharing a secret, and my voice was just as quiet as hers. A soft, cool whisper meant only for her. "You didn't invite me," I replied. I watched the words land, watched them extinguish the last flicker of defiance in her eyes, leaving behind nothing but the black, empty ash of understanding. I had not done this for money or for a promotion. I had done this because she had told me I wasn't welcome. It was a revenge so personal, so exquisitely tailored to the original wound, that there was no defense against it. As I held her gaze, the noise of the room around me began to recede. The panicked voices and shuffling feet blurring into a distant, meaningless roar. The world narrowed to just the two of us, standing in the wreckage of the lives she had so carelessly built. The only sound that broke through the muffled chaos was sharp, clear, and perfectly distinct. It was the sound of Danielle's champagne flute, forgotten in her hand, slipping from her nerveless fingers and shattering on the cold marble floor. The sound of the breaking glass was the exclamation point at the end of a long and painful sentence. It was the sound of a spell breaking, of an illusion being rendered into 1,000 tiny, irreparable pieces. It was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. The 2 days following the reunion were a strange, hollow purgatory. I went to work, sat at my small grey desk in the bullpen, and processed data with a placid expression on my face. Around me, the office was a maelstrom of whispered gossip. The story of the party had spread through the corporate grapevine with the speed and ferocity of a wildfire. Every conversation in the break room would die down to a sudden, awkward silence the moment I approached. Every trip to the coffee machine was accompanied by the feeling of dozens of curious, speculative eyes on my back. I was no longer an anonymous drone. I was a curiosity, a key figure in a drama that was rapidly becoming a corporate legend. The official news came not with a bang, but with the quiet, clinical finality of a digital keystroke. On Tuesday morning, anyone who tried to email Danielle Whitmore received an automated reply. This user is no longer with the company. Please redirect all inquiries to the PR department head. Her name vanished from the internal directory. Her glowing profile on the company intranet was replaced by a sterile error 404 message. She hadn't been fired. Not yet. The official term was indefinitely suspended, pending the results of a full internal investigation. It was a corporate execution carried out with bloodless, bureaucratic precision. The shock waves radiated outward. The PR department, once the vibrant, glamorous hub of the 17th floor, became a ghost town. Rumors swirled of team members being called into conference rooms one by one for grueling interviews with auditors and corporate lawyers. The confident, easygoing atmosphere was replaced by a pall of fear and suspicion. At the center of that particular storm was Arthur Coulson. He hadn't been suspended, but his fate was arguably worse. He was a dead man walking. I saw him once striding down the hallway with his usual air of authority, but it was a hollow performance. His face was pale and drawn, and his eyes, which had always held a look of predatory confidence, were now haunted by the hunted look of a man who knows the walls are closing in. His authority was an illusion. Everyone knew he was a dead man walking, his career hanging by the thread of an investigation that I knew, with absolute certainty, would lead directly to his complicity or, at best, his gross negligence. On Wednesday afternoon, I received the summons I had been anticipating. It was an email from the Senior Vice President of Human Resources, a woman named Eleanor Albright. The message was brief and devoid of emotion. Clara, please come to my office at 3 p.m. to discuss a matter of departmental oversight. As I rode the elevator up to the executive floor, the same floor that housed Coulson's corner suite, I felt a strange sense of calm. There was no anxiety, no fear. The game was playing out exactly as I had calculated. Ms. Albright's office was predictably intimidating, with a commanding view of the city skyline. She was a stern, intelligent woman in her 60s with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through the usual corporate platitudes. She did not waste time with small talk. Clara, she said, gesturing for me to sit. As you are aware, there is an ongoing and sensitive investigation involving the Public Relations Department. As a result, we are making some immediate changes to the oversight structure for several key projects, including Project Synergy. I simply nodded, my hands resting calmly in my lap. Mr. Coulson is recusing himself from his compliance oversight duties for the time being, she continued. A master of the corporate euphemism. Given your history with the project and your exemplary record in the compliance field, the board has asked if you would be willing to step in. We want you to assume temporary leadership of the compliance monitoring for all active PR campaigns, effective immediately. It was a breathtaking reversal of fortune. Less than a month ago, I had been demoted and exiled from this very project. Now they were handing me the keys to the kingdom. They weren't just giving me my old job back, they were giving me Coulson's. It was a promotion born from the ashes of the careers of the two people who had tried to destroy mine. I allowed a moment of thoughtful silence to pass, as if I was seriously weighing the offer. Then I looked at Ms. Albright directly in the eye and gave her a small, professional smile. I'm ready to help in any way I can, I said. I'm ready to start immediately. My return to the 17th floor was a quiet spectacle. The logistics team had already been instructed to move my belongings back into my old glass-walled office. As I walked past the PR department, the few employees who were at their desks fell silent, their eyes following me with a new kind of expression. It wasn't pity anymore. It was a potent cocktail of awe, fear, and suspicion. The rumors had solidified into a working theory, one that I could see being debated on the internal messaging system. Snippets of conversation would pop up on my screen from colleagues who had forgotten I was on their general chat lists. Did you hear? They put Whitmore's sister in charge of the compliance side. The one who got demoted. No way. It was her at the party, right? She was running the slideshow. You don't think she's the one who exposed the whole thing? It has to be. I became a ghost of a different sort. Not an invisible one, but a haunting one. A cautionary tale, the quiet compliance girl who had, in a single night, brought down the company's golden child and a senior vice president. I neither confirmed nor denied the rumors. When people asked me what had happened, I would simply give them a sad, weary look and say, it's a difficult family matter. My silence was more powerful than any confession. It allowed their imaginations to run wild, to paint me as a master strategist, a silent avenger. In a way, they weren't wrong. Amidst this professional maelstrom, there was a profound silence from the one place I expected noise, my family. My phone remained dead quiet. There were no furious calls from my father demanding an explanation. There were no tearful, pleading messages from my mother. There was nothing. It was as if, in their eyes, I had ceased to exist. Or perhaps I had become something so monstrous, so alien to their understanding of the world, that they were simply afraid to engage. I had not only broken their perfect family, I had broken the rules of their universe, and the silence was my punishment, or perhaps my reward. That evening, I didn't go home. I drove out of the city. The urban sprawl giving way to the manicured suburbs and then to the winding country roads that led to Maple Crest. I didn't drive to the villa. I parked at a public scenic overlook on the other side of the lake. From there, the great glass house was just a collection of warm, distant lights, a tiny diorama of a life I no longer belonged to. I had brought a bottle of expensive red wine with me, a vintage I could never have afforded a week ago. I poured some into a paper cup and sat on the hood of my car, the cool evening air chilling my skin. I looked at the lights of the villa, the place where my previous life had been so spectacularly emulated. I had expected to feel a surge of triumph, a rush of victorious adrenaline. But that wasn't it. The fury that had been a coiled serpent in my gut for years was gone. The deep, aching need for validation, for recognition, had vanished. All the dark, heavy things I had been carrying for so long had been burned away in the fire of that one night, and in their place was a quiet, expansive emptiness. It wasn't a painful void, but a peaceful one. It was the stillness of a battlefield after the war is over. It was the clean, quiet ache of a wound that has finally been lanced. As I took a sip of the wine, I felt something inside me dissolve. It wasn't regret. It wasn't guilt. It was the last brittle remnant of the person I used to be. The girl who was always trying to earn her invitation to the party. It was relief. The profound, soul-deep relief of being, for the first time in my life, completely and utterly free. It was a Saturday, 3 days after I had reclaimed my office. The silence from my family had stretched into a thick, heavy blanket, a wall of unspoken condemnation that I found, to my surprise, to be quite comfortable. My apartment had become a sanctuary, a quiet haven of order that I had built for myself. The weekend sunlight streamed through the clean windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For the first time, the quiet didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like peace. I was making coffee, the rich, dark scent filling my small kitchen. When the sound came, a knock on my door. It wasn't the sharp, confident rap of a delivery person. It was hesitant, soft, almost a timid scratching, as if the person on the other side was terrified of being heard. I froze, the coffee pot in my hand. No one ever came to my apartment unannounced. My world was one of scheduled appointments and digital communications. An unexpected knock at the door felt like a breach, a violation of the new peace I was so carefully cultivating. I set the pot down and walked to the door, my footsteps silent on the hardwood floor. I peered through the peephole, and my breath caught in my throat. The distorted fisheye lens showed me a face I barely recognized. Though I had known it my entire life, it was Danielle. But it was a version of her that I had never seen before. Her usually perfect blonde hair was a mess, scraped back into a haphazard ponytail. Her face was pale and puffy, her eyes swollen and raw from what must have been days of crying. She was wearing a crumpled sweatshirt and leggings, a far cry from the designer armor she usually wore. She looked small and broken and utterly lost. I took a deep, steadying breath, my hand resting on the doorknob. A part of me, a deeply buried, vestigial instinct, wanted to keep the door shut, to pretend I wasn't home. But I knew I couldn't. This was the final act. This was the epilogue that had to be written. I turned the deadbolt, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet apartment, and opened the door. She flinched at the sound, her red-rimmed eyes blinking in the sudden light from my hallway. She looked at me, and for a moment, there was nothing but the vast, silent chasm that now separated us. The queen of the family, the star of every show, was standing on my welcome mat like a beggar. "Clara," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken rasp. "Danielle," I replied, my voice even and cool. I did not invite her in. I stood my ground, my body partially blocking the entrance. This was my territory. She was not welcome here. She seemed to shrink under my calm, unwavering gaze. The last time we had locked eyes, it had been across a room full of people in the wreckage of her life. Now there was no one else to perform for. It was just the two of us, stripped of all pretense. "Why?" she finally managed to choke out, a single, desperate tear tracing a path down her puffy cheek. "Why did you have to do it? To destroy everything? I'm your sister." The words, which should have been a plea, landed as an accusation. "I'm your sister." It was the same logic our family had always operated on. The unspoken rule that her position, her feelings, her needs were paramount. It was the same logic that had allowed her to slander me to my boss, to have me demoted, to have me uninvited from my own family's gathering. The audacity of her using that phrase now, as if it were a shield she could still hide behind, was breathtaking. I looked at her, at this wreck of a human being who still believed she was the center of the universe, and I felt a profound, chilling stillness settle over me. The last vestiges of my anger had burned out, leaving behind only the cold, hard truth. "You forgot," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding, "that I was also a daughter in that family." My words struck her with a physical force. She recoiled as if I had slapped her. She shook her head, a gesture of denial, but a fresh wave of tears began to fall. The raw, primal grief of a child who has finally been told no. "That's not true," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "It was never about you. It was never about hurting you. I just wanted them to be proud of me. I wanted Dad to look at me the way he looks at his business partners. I wanted Mom to have something to brag about to her friends. Is that so wrong?" I listened to her confession. This raw, pathetic admission of the insecurity that had fueled her entire life. For a fleeting moment, I felt a flicker of something that might have been pity. The endless, exhausting performance she had been putting on for 30 years, the desperate scramble to maintain her position as the golden child. It must have been a crushing weight, but the pity was quickly extinguished by the cold light of reality. Her desire to be seen had required me to be invisible. Her need to be praised had been built on my silence. I looked her straight in the eye, my gaze unblinking. I would not offer her comfort. I would not give her absolution. I would only give her the truth she had spent her entire life avoiding. There's nothing wrong with wanting them to be proud, I said, my voice softening just a fraction, but my words holding the sharp edge of a scalpel. But you could have done it by actually being something to be proud of. You had every advantage, every opportunity. But that wasn't enough for you. It was easier to just play the part. You wanted the applause without the effort. The problem, Danielle, is that you just wished you had let other people have a real chance to be proud instead of just performing. The truth of my words seemed to shatter the last of her defenses. A terrible, animal sound of despair escaped her throat, and her body crumpled. She sank to her knees on the rough coir of my doormat, her hands covering her face as she sobbed, her whole body shaking with the force of her grief. It was the ultimate act of surrender, the final, pathetic gesture of a queen who had lost her throne and was now begging at the feet of the peasant who had deposed her. Please, Clara, she begged, her voice muffled by her hands. Please, you can fix this. Retract the email. Tell them you made a mistake, that the data was wrong. You can tell them I didn't know what I was doing, that Coulson manipulated me. I looked down at my younger sister, kneeling on my doorstep, begging me to help her lie, to help her escape the consequences of her own actions. She was still trying to find a backstage exit, a way to rewrite the ending of the show. She still didn't understand. The show was over. The lights were out. The audience had gone home. All that was left was the truth. I said nothing. I simply reached for the edge of my door. She must have sensed the movement, because she looked up. Her face a mess of tears and desperation. Her eyes widened as she saw my hand on the door. Clara, no, she whispered. Please don't. I looked at her one last time. You can't retract the truth. Danielle, I said, my voice quiet, but utterly final. And then, slowly, deliberately, I closed the door. The heavy wood swung shut, the latch clicking into place with a definitive sound. I engaged the deadbolt, the solid thud echoing in the sudden, profound silence of my apartment. I stood there, my forehead resting against the cool wood of the door, and I listened. I heard a single, choked gasp from the other side. It was a sound of utter desolation, the sound of a soul hitting rock bottom. It was followed by a few seconds of ragged, painful breathing, then silence. I waited, my own breath held for another sob, another plea, but there was nothing. After a minute that felt like an hour, I heard the faint shuffling sound of her getting to her feet, and then the soft, retreating footsteps fading down the hall. She was gone. Outside my window, the wind had picked up, rattling the glass in its frame. It was a cold, lonely sound. But inside my apartment, it was quiet. The game was over, and I had won. The week that followed my confrontation with Danielle was a masterclass in corporate bureaucracy. My temporary role as compliance lead for the PR department became a full-time job of sifting through the wreckage. I was a forensic accountant and a digital archaeologist, poring over years of expense reports, vendor contracts, and internal communications. With every file I opened, the picture of Danielle's recklessness and Coulson's willful ignorance became clearer. The $240,000 fraud was not an isolated incident. It was merely the most blatant example in a long-standing pattern of mismanagement and ethical decay. I documented everything with the dispassionate precision of a surgeon, compiling a report that was both irrefutable and utterly devastating. I wasn't just doing my job. I was sanitizing a wound, cutting away the diseased tissue so the company could begin to heal. I submitted my final report to Eleanor Albright and the legal department on a Friday morning. Then I waited. The corporate wheels of justice grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. For another week, an uneasy quiet settled over the 17th floor. The investigation was now out of my hands, A black box of executive meetings and legal consultations. I focused on my work, establishing new, stricter protocols for the terrified remnants of the PR team. My presence, a constant, silent reminder of the consequences of cutting corners. The call came the following Wednesday. My phone rang, displaying Eleanor Albright's name. I took a deep breath and answered, my voice a calm, professional monotone. Clara Whitmore. Clara, she said, her tone devoid of any preamble. The board has concluded its review. The investigation is officially closed. I said nothing, simply waiting for the verdict. Based on the findings, she continued, her voice as crisp as a legal document, Arthur Coulson has been separated from the company, effective immediately. The official reason cited is a catastrophic failure of executive oversight. Separated from the company, the gentle, bloodless language of a corporate beheading. Coulson was out. His silver hair, his predatory smile, his corner office, all erased from the corporate landscape, as if they had never existed. And Danielle Whitmore? I asked, my voice betraying no emotion. There was a slight pause on the other end of the line. Ms. Whitmore's employment has been terminated for cause, Eleanor said. And this time the language was sharp, devoid of any euphemism. Her actions were found to be in direct violation of the company's code of conduct, ethics policy, and several federal statutes. She is, of course, permanently barred from seeking any future employment with this corporation, or any of its global subsidiaries. Legal is handling the necessary reporting to the relevant authorities. The finality of it was absolute. Not just fired, but permanently blacklisted. Her name was now a permanent stain on the company's records, a cautionary tale to be whispered in break rooms for years to come. The Queen was not just deposed. She was exiled from the kingdom forever. She was exiled from the kingdom forever. I understand, I said quietly. Thank you for letting me know. There is one more thing, Eleanor said. You'll be receiving an email shortly. The official announcement regarding your new position will go out tomorrow morning. She hung up. A few moments later, an email notification chimed on my computer. It wasn't the announcement from HR. The sender was Robert Harrison, the CEO. My heart, which had remained steady throughout the call with Eleanor, gave a single hard thump against my ribs. I had never received a direct email from the CEO before. I clicked it open. The message was brief, just 3 sentences long. Clara, I have been fully briefed on the results of the investigation. I want to personally thank you for your integrity and courage in upholding the ethical standards of this company. We are fortunate to have you. Sincerely, Robert Harrison. I read the email once. Then again, it was a simple corporate communication, likely vetted by a team of lawyers, but to me, it was a revelation. For my entire life, I had worked in the shadow of my father, a senior executive in this very company, and I had never once received this kind of direct, unambiguous validation from him. I had craved his approval, his acknowledgement of my competence, and it had always been withheld or granted only in relation to my sister. Now here it was, bestowed upon me by the most powerful man in the company, not for being charming or personable, but for being exactly who I was, meticulous, uncompromising, and ethical, for doing my job. As if summoned by the thought, my personal phone buzzed on the desk beside me, a text message. It was from my father. My fingers felt strangely numb as I picked it up. For weeks, there had been only silence. Now, in the wake of the official verdict, he was finally reaching out. The message was not an apology. It was not an olive branch. It was a command, we need to talk, Clara. I stared at the words, at the familiar, authoritative tone he had always used with me, the tone of a father summoning a disobedient child to his study. He still saw me as the problem, as the one who needed to explain her actions. He still didn't understand that the entire universe had shifted on its axis. He was a king who hadn't realized his throne had been turned to dust. I thought about all the years of forced apologies, of being made to feel that my quiet competence was a social failing, of being told to learn from a sister who was a walking, talking ethical violation. I thought of all the times I had swallowed my pride and smoothed things over for the sake of a family peace that was, in itself, a lie. I took a deep breath and, with steady thumbs, I typed my reply. For the first time in my life, I don't have to apologize for doing the right thing. I hit send. I did not wait for a response. I placed the phone face down on my desk and turned back to my work. A door had closed. Quietly but definitively, the long, exhausting audition for my father's approval was finally over. I had not been cast. It turned out I didn't need the part. The next morning, as Eleanor had promised, the company-wide email went out. It announced the termination of Coulson and the appointment of Clara Whitmore to the newly created position of Regional Director of Compliance, with full oversight of all North American marketing and public relations divisions. My temporary authority was now permanent. My position, carved in stone. Later that day, I stood in my office, the same glass-walled office they had taken from me a lifetime ago. The nameplate on the door, which had been blank for weeks, now bore my name in crisp black letters, Clara Whitmore, Regional Director. I looked at my reflection in the glass, at the woman staring back at me. She looked the same. Same sensible haircut, same practical clothes, same calm expression, but her eyes were different. The quiet, persistent ache of being overlooked was gone. In its place was a stillness, a self-possessed clarity that was as hard and as beautiful as a diamond. I whispered the words to my reflection, a quiet acknowledgement of the profound irony of my journey. Being uninvited was the best thing that ever happened to me. My sister's voice echoed in my memory. The words as clear as the day she'd said them, dripping with condescending pity. "You're not invited." The words no longer had the power to wound me. They were just a statement of fact, a catalyst that had set in motion an unstoppable chain of events. They were the key that had unlocked a door I never knew existed. A small smile touched my lips as I turned away from the glass and looked out over the corporate campus. A kingdom I now helped to guard. "You're right," I thought, a silent reply to the ghost of my sister. I wasn't invited. It doesn't matter. I built my own party. A month later, the world had rearranged itself. My name, once whispered in the corporate hallways as a symbol of quiet rebellion, had taken on a different dimension. The story, in its sanitized, legally approved version, had leaked beyond the company walls. I had become an accidental icon, a case study in corporate governance seminars, and a minor hero in online forums dedicated to workplace justice. I was the quiet compliance girl who had roared. The invitations started to arrive. At first, they were small requests to sit on internal ethics panels, to lead departmental training sessions. Then the invitations started coming from outside the company. And one afternoon, an email landed in my inbox that made me pause. It was from the organizers of the annual Women in Ethics Summit, one of the most prestigious professional conferences in the country. They wanted me to be a keynote speaker. They wanted me to tell my story, or at least a version of it, that I was comfortable sharing. They wanted to know how I had navigated a complex ethical challenge and maintained personal and professional integrity under pressure. The irony was a thing of crystalline beauty. A year ago, I would have paid to attend this conference, to sit in the audience and take notes. A month ago, I couldn't even get an invitation to my own family's party. Now they were offering me the main stage, the spotlight, and an honorarium that was more than my first year's salary. The day of the summit was bright and cold. The conference was held in a grand downtown hotel ballroom, a vast space filled with hundreds of women, lawyers, executives, academics, and regulators. The energy in the room was the complete antithesis of the Maple Crest Villa. It wasn't the brittle, performative hum of a social event. It was the focused, vibrant buzz of professionals gathered to exchange ideas. Here, success was measured not in the perfection of the facade, but in the substance of one's work. I stood backstage, my notes held loosely in one hand, and watched the preceding speaker finish her presentation to a round of warm, respectful applause. I felt a familiar stillness settle over me. The same calm I had felt in the empty office in the dead of night. The same peace I had felt sitting on the hood of my car looking out over the lake. This was not a performance. This was a reckoning of a different kind. My introduction was read, a list of my professional accomplishments culminating in my new title, Regional Director of Compliance. I walked out from the wings and onto the stage. The spotlight was warm on my face, a bright, clarifying glare that blocked out the individual faces in the crowd, turning them into a single, expectancy of silhouettes. I stepped up to the lectern, set my notes down without looking at them, and took a deep, steadying breath. I looked out into the darkness, into the heart of the attention that was now focused solely on me, and I began. "Good afternoon," I said, my voice clear and steady, amplified by the microphone to fill every corner of the vast hall. Once, I was uninvited from a table. I paused. The line hung in the air, simple and personal, yet resonating with a universal truth that I knew many in the room would understand. It was the story of every woman who had ever been talked over in a meeting, passed over for a promotion, or told she wasn't a good fit for the boys' club. It was a beautiful table, I continued, laden with all the promises of success and belonging. And I was told, quite clearly, that there was no seat for me there. So today, I continued, my voice gaining strength, I want to talk about what happens when you stop waiting for a seat and you decide to build a new table instead. A wave of applause, spontaneous and powerful, rolled through the ballroom. It wasn't polite. It was a sound of recognition, of solidarity. In that moment, I knew I was not alone. As the applause subsided, my eyes adjusted to the glare, and I began to make out the shapes of faces in the crowd. I spoke about the nature of corporate ethics, not as a set of rules to be memorized, but as a series of choices made every day in the quiet moments when no one is watching. I told them that integrity is not a grand, heroic gesture, but the slow, patient accumulation of doing the right thing over and over again, especially when it is difficult. I did not mention my family by name. I did not mention Danielle or Coulson. I didn't have to. I spoke in parables, in the universal language of professional ethics. And as I spoke, my gaze drifted across the room, scanning the rows of attentive faces. And then I saw her. She was sitting in the back, near an exit, as if poised for a quick escape. She was alone, a small, solitary figure in a sea of people. She wore a simple dark blazer, and her hair was pulled back in a severe, joyless style. She looked thinner, paler. The radiant, effortless glow that had been her defining characteristic was gone, extinguished, leaving behind something weary and anonymous. It was Danielle. Our eyes did not meet. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor in front of her, her posture rigid, her hands clenched in her lap. She was not here as a supporter. She was here as a ghost, haunting the periphery of a world she had once commanded. She was a spectator at my coronation, forced to witness the final, definitive reversal of our roles. The star was now in the shadows. The stagehand was now in the spotlight. I felt no pity. I felt no anger. I felt nothing at all but the profound, quiet finality of a chapter that had at long last been closed. I brought my speech to its conclusion, my eyes leaving the ghost in the back of the room, and returning to the hopeful, engaged faces in front of me. We are often told that forgiveness is a virtue, I said, my voice softening. And it is, but we are not required to grant it to those who have never asked for it. Sometimes the most powerful act of forgiveness is the one we grant to ourselves. The forgiveness to stop seeking approval from those who are incapable of giving it. The forgiveness to walk away from the tables where we are not welcome. I paused, letting the words settle. Because true forgiveness isn't weakness. It's freedom. It's the freedom from the people who never invited you in the first place. The camera on the side of the stage, the one broadcasting the event live, moved in for a close-up. I could feel its unblinking lens on me. I looked directly into it, not for the audience in the room, but for the countless others watching, the ones who were still waiting for their invitation. A small, serene smile touched my lips. My voice was calm. A simple statement of a truth I had earned with fire and ice. The invitation was mine all along. The lights faded. The screen went to black. The scene ended.